Era frequente o meu marido ter pesadelos horríveis e acordar a gritar com medo. Annie, que tinha mudado de nome para proteger a sua identidade, disse numa entrevista: "Nos últimos anos tenho andado a fugir ao perigo de ser assassinada." Expus um campo de concentração escondido dentro do hospital. O incinerador, na Casa da Caldeira, também era usado como forno crematório.
So every day I get a large number of emails relating with human rights violations around the world. So when Annie made her statement, which was published in the Economic Times, I got this story. From an early age, what I wanted to do was to do something about the Holocaust, to try to learn the lessons from it. 4 lessons I've tried to apply from the Holocaust, one of which is bring to justice mass murderers. Second is combating incitement to hatred. A third is protecting refugees. And a fourth is asserting universal human rights values by standing up for victims wherever they are. But it's also very much related to my refugee practice, because I'm a lawyer representing refugee claimants coming from around the world who have these stories of persecution, which then have to be established before an administrative tribunal, and they don't have witnesses, they don't have documents, they don't have forensic proof. They just come with their stories. I was involved in Amnesty International and all sorts of human rights organizations. These organizations do have research departments, but they're very simple research departments. They're not involved in sophisticated analytical research. I'm well used to dealing with this kind of evidentiary vacuum and trying to establish what happened. I've seen lots of burnout. I mean, people just, they get either discouraged or blasé, or they just can't take it. My daily life is mass murder, torture, sexual abuse, and so on. And I mean, unless you approach this dispassionately, you won't be able to deal with it. And I feel that what I can contribute to this, to combat these problems, is analysis, professionalism, a kind of a dispassionate approach, logic. I mean, there's lots of people that are upset and excited, and my getting upset and excited isn't really going to help the issue at all. So I figured, you know, this was something nobody else was going to do. I mean, this fit all these criteria, so I said, yes, okay, sure.
What most people don't realize is that the Chinese regime believes it can get away with almost anything, and that the West doesn't really care about what they do to their own people, so long as their own interests aren't affected.
Every time I would go into town, there would be these people protesting in front of the consulate, day or night, rain or shine. And I got interested in what was going on. I didn't know much about Falun Gong at that point.
Falun Gong is a set of exercises with a spiritual foundation, which was started in 1992 by Li Hongji, who began teaching about it. It is a blending and updating of ancient Chinese traditions, of the Qigong, the exercise traditions, the Taoism and Buddhism. I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner, and neither is David Kilgore, and to a certain extent we got involved in this partly because we were outsiders and independent and were able to exercise an independent judgment on this whole issue.
David Matas e David Kilgore publicaram Bloody Harvest, uma investigação minuciosa sobre as alegações de recolha de órgãos realizadas em seguidores de Falun Gong vivos.
It spread throughout China very quickly, because this was after the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the shift within China from socialism to capitalism, so that there was an ideological vacuum in China. The Falun Gong was actually encouraged initially by the authorities on the basis that it was healthful and it cut down on the health bill and a system which was financially in dire straits because of the extraction of money away from the health system. And it grew from a standing start in 92 until 99, according to government estimates. It was 70 to 100 million practitioners, which was more at the time than the membership of the Communist Party, which was 60 million. And the party at this point took ideological fright and became jealous of the popularity of a movement which was rooted in ancient Chinese traditions, spiritual, totally different from the Communist Party, which was atheist. And the party banned it in '99 out of this jealousy and fear, and has since propagandized against it and has insisted that people abandon the practice. If they find practitioners in China, they arrest them, ask them to recant. If they don't recant, they're tortured. If they don't recant after torture, they're disappeared. And they have become, by far, the #1 torture victims in China. They are detained to this day in the hundreds of thousands in the East re-education through labor camps. I was co-chair of the Canadian Helsinki Watch Group, and I basically did an analysis of communism as a root cause of human rights violations. And I went through the communist perspective on human rights and the communist ideology of dictatorship, the proletariat and the leading role of the party. Philosophically, I tried to explain how it generates human rights violations. Ideologically, even though they may mouth the vocabulary of human rights, they don't really think of human rights as belonging to humanity. They think of it as belonging to them. There's a Yuri Andropov who succeeded Brezhnev. He says, any citizen of the Soviet Union whose interests coincide with the interests of society feels the entire scope of our democratic freedoms. It is another matter if those interests do not coincide. Within the revolution, complete freedom. Against the revolution, none. This was the Communist Party when it was socialist. But then what we have is that the Communist Party of China is both communist and capitalist. It's abandoned socialism. Communism was kind of socialism by force, and socialism was the ethic, and communism was the way it was imposed. But remove socialism from the communist equation, there's no ethic at all. It becomes cannibal capitalism. It's cannibalism without the rule of law, cannibalism without ethical structure. Anything to make a buck.
I think that it's vital that the international community come to a better and clearer understanding of the Chinese regime, who they are, what they do, and what they've been doing. There are things that are happening in China which are of enormous historical significance. The persecution of Falun Gong is one of the most horrific, large scale. There were 70 to 100 million Falun Gong practitioners when the persecution started. All of them were instantly put under persecution.
I had never expected to see this in my lifetime.
There's no moral ambiguity. There's no shades of meaning about this. It's an evil crime, and it's happening. I mean, this is the case.
We do know for a fact that there's large-scale executions in China. We do know for a fact that executed prisoners have their organs harvested unwilling, without their consent. We do know for a fact that the Falun Gong are depersonalized, dehumanized, and marginalized, repressed, persecuted, both in word and in deed, in the most vile ways possible.
One of the first people we met with was the wife of a former surgeon, and she told us, I guess this was 2006, she's now a refugee living in the United States. She told us that her husband, during the period 2001-2003, had removed the corneas from the eyes of approximately 2,000 Falun Gong practitioners. Their corneas would be removed, then they're unconscious at this point. They'd be taken into another room, and their heart, lung, all their vital organs would be removed for sale purposes.
我的前夫曾经参与过摘除法轮功学员器官的手术，他是一名脑外科医生。参与摘除法轮功学员眼角膜手术，包括部分在法轮功学员活体上摘除眼角膜。我的家人告诉我说，他说你不知道我有多么痛苦，因为这些法轮功学员是活的。事情都是秘密进行的，我们医院参与的医生很多是从其他医院调过来的实习医生。这些人的器官被摘除以后，有的人就直接被丢进焚尸炉中火化，没有留下任何痕迹。
What lawyers and courts do is you get in all the evidence, and then you make a conclusion after you've heard all the evidence based on all the evidence. What I was faced with this was a methodological problem. It happens in an operating room, no public access, clean up immediately afterwards, no crime scene. People are killed, bodies cremated, no corpses, no victims, and nobody to testify about what happened to them. We started setting up trails of proof and trails of disproof. Let's get on all the evidence and see where it leads.
Quando analisamos os factos que rodeiam esta questão, a conclusão torna-se difícil de negar. Um dado importante a considerar é o tempo. O tempo médio de espera por órgãos viáveis é bastante longo, pois os órgãos adequados a transplante devem vir de pessoas saudáveis. Consequentemente, o tempo médio de espera por um coração é de 8 meses, por um fígado é de 26 meses e por um rim é de 37 meses.
A patient of mine who has been hospitalized for more than a year in my department being at the top list of candidates for heart transplantation, what we call status 1, and we couldn't find a heart for him, has come to me, approached me one day and told me, Professor Levy, I'm about to go to China in 2 weeks' time, and they've scheduled me for a heart transplantation. And I looked at him and I thought that he was kidding, but he was dead serious. And that's actually what happened. The guy went to China, and exactly on the same date that he was told ahead of time, 2 weeks ahead of time, he got his heart transplant. This got me going into a quite extensive research to find out how come somebody can schedule a heart transplant ahead of time. What I found was something that was obvious for many years, and I didn't know about it, that for more than 20 years, organ procurement in China from executed prisoners has been taking place under official legal knowledge of all authorities in China. And actually, organs from these executed prisoners have been used for any patients flocking from all over the world who could afford to get a transplant from these prisoners.
It becomes a little difficult to differentiate between whether or not the execution is being performed for the execution or for the donation. So it's convenient. It's hard sometimes. We cross a barrier here. Is this a patient who's going to be executed anyway? Or is the execution a part of the fact, well, there's some good organs here? We know that some of the executions are timed for the organ transplants. So we know that has to be true, certainly for heart and sometimes and liver transplants too. You need to time it. You know, you have a recipient and your donor. Well, when are you going to shoot them? When are you going to poison them? When are you going to do it? Well, that's nauseating. It's disgusting. It's criminal.
I read a paper in the medical literature saying that they developed a method in China where they cover a severely burned patient with almost 90% burnt with a human skin as a temporary coverage. We are using the same method all over the world with narrow strips of skin that are taken from cadavers. But this article from China said that they use a whole body skin, like a whole envelope. And I asked the surgeon, how do you freeze such a huge piece of skin? He said, no, we are not using any freezing method. I said, how come? He said, we are using only fresh. So how you happen to have fresh skin in such huge dimension? He said, no, in every given moment, there are hundreds of people in China waiting for a death sentence. And we call the prison, so they shoot the person in the right dimension to the patient that I need to treat. And when I've heard that, I understand that this wonderful method that was described in the medical literature is not valid for me on the ethical basis. I cannot use it, even though I want very much to save the life of the patient that I'm in charge.
41,500 transplants over a 6-year period cannot be explained by executed criminals.
What I could see in terms of trends was that transplant volumes on a multi-year basis were pretty constant before the persecution of Falun Gong and then shot up after the persecution of Falun Gong began. And then, so, I mean, obviously, one explanation is the killing of Falun Gong for their organs. So this became, it's not conclusive by itself, but it's sort of one piece of evidence in support of the allegation.
For me, the safest thing is to look at what the Chinese government is saying. The Chinese Liver Transplant Registry itself, which the Chinese government-supported Ministry of Health website, has reported approximately 20,000 liver transplants from executed prisoners. So just by going by Chinese government numbers alone, and that's incontrovertible, that's their data, not someone else's, and not someone who has a political agenda with them. Their own data is enough, as far as I'm concerned.
I must confess, I mean, obviously this whole subject matter is very troubling, but for me, that was one of the most chilling aspects of it. Going around, talking to different practitioners around the world that hadn't met each other, hadn't talked to each other. All they wanted to talk about was their torture. I mean, that's what they knew that had happened to them. And I would ask them, you know, about blood testing, and every one of them blood tested. They didn't matter to them, didn't hurt them, didn't see the significance. And the non-Falun Gong practitioners that were in prison, got out of prison out of China, didn't happen.
Everyone was taken to do the physical checkup and the blood test. They do not care about our health, but why they do the checkup for us?
She wasn't being examined for her health. She was being examined to see whether, an ultrasound, through an ultrasound to see whether her organs were in good condition for being sold. This is something unimaginable to I think, to most human beings.
It's necessary for transplants because you need blood type compatibility for transplants. And it becomes much more obvious that it's only for organ transplants because they would avoid any test that had no use for organ transplants, and they would do every test that was essential for organ transplants.
It all goes into a computer bank. When you arrive for your kidney, the match is made by computer, and Miss Lee is taken out of the camp to a hospital. She's given some kind of an anesthetic and a needle, and both kidneys are taken, all vital organs are taken. She is dead, and her body is burned, and it's counted as a suicide, and you get your new kidney.
A trail that went somewhere wild, for instance, was the phone calls.
We had people, for example, calling into China to hospitals and prisons and saying, do you have Falun Gong practitioners available for organs? And the answer in about 15 institutions across the country was yes. We recorded those conversations. We had independent interpreters. The Falun Gong practitioners don't smoke and drink. They're healthy. They exercise. They tend to be healthy on our phone calls. Push this point too that the people want organs from Falun Gong. That's why they would phone the hospitals and ask them if they have Falun Gong.
The telephone numbers were in fact.
Yes, I have the list of the phone numbers, the dates. Believe me, I used to be a prosecutor. I knew that there would be cynicism, and I did my utmost to make sure that everything was satisfactorily and properly and correctly and ethically done.
Like we had websites of hospitals advertising wait times and at prices, boasting about how much money they were making.
O website da Rede Internacional de Transplantes da China afirma que pode encontrar dadores de órgãos imediatamente. Uma outra página afirma: antes do transplante verificaremos a função renal do dador, por isso é mais seguro do que noutros países, onde o órgão não vem de dador vivo.
Cao Dong is in his 30s. He'd been a prisoner in northern China, and he gave a very nervous, understandably, very nervous report of what he had seen in that prison. I asked him whether he was aware of the practice of what is known as organ harvesting, which is taking body parts from prisoners to order, in effect. This is a trade which is run by the People's Liberation Army for profit. And he could only tell me that he had a friend, another Falun Gong practitioner, in the prison in northwest China. The friend disappeared one day, and the next time he saw him was his body, the friend's body, in the prison hospital with holes where body parts had apparently been removed. After the meeting I had with these former prisoners, they were all arrested. Cao Dong was later convicted of meeting me, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and he remains in prison now.
Em 2002, uma testemunha, um agente armado da polícia que trabalhava para o Serviço de Segurança Pública, participou em detenções ilegais e na tortura de seguidores do Falun Gong. Ele fez-nos um relato em primeira mão sobre uma seguidora do Falun Gong. Ele disse que após uma semana de tortura intensa e de ser forçada a ingerir comida, ela tinha feridas e cicatrizes em todo o corpo. Depois, enquanto estava completamente consciente, sem qualquer anestesia, abriram-lhe o peito com um bisturi. O sangue jorrou e ela gritou de dor a dizer: "O Falun Gong é fantástico." Depois disse: "Mataram-me a mim, um único indivíduo. Não vão matar-nos a todos." Nesse momento, o médico hesitou, mas continuou a cortar as veias. O coração foi retirado primeiro, depois foram os rins. Quando a tesoura cortou as veias do coração, ela começou a contorcer-se. Foi horrível. Parecia que algo estava a rasgar-se. Ela tinha a boca e os olhos completamente abertos. Não quero continuar.
What happens in China has ramifications elsewhere. As long as China becomes the cheap route for the wealthy in those countries to buzz off to China, get an organ from executed prisoners, why would those countries work to develop effective alternatives within those countries to address the needs of their people?
In no country that we know of, and in no country represented in the World Medical Association, in which there are 83 national medical associations from all over the globe, in no one it is allowed to sell and to purchase an organ for transplantation.
So the Organ Transplant Center, the Armed Police General Hospital in Beijing, our Organ Transplant Center is our main department for making money. So what you've got is now these army hospitals killing Falun Gong practitioners for their organs as a way of making money. There's a lot of trade with China. China has slave labor camps where about half of them are Falun Gong practitioners. Nobody can get in, nobody knows the exact numbers. There's this Laogai Foundation that makes estimates, but it's between 2 and 4 million people. And the people we talk to get out, you know, they say they're making these products which they see on Western shelves or components of them. And so China's underpricing the market. I mean, if you look at a lot of stuff you buy in stores, a lot of it just says made in China. It doesn't say made in China by slave labor, but that's likely to be the case.
And we've actually talked to people who've been in these camps, Falun Gong practitioners, and I'm going to talk tomorrow about a young woman who worked 16 hours a day making products for export.
In the dispatching center, we were forced to wrap the chopsticks by using a piece of paper, and on it said the chopstick is sanitized, so rest assured to use it. And they were then distributed to the market, and people just use it, but it's very dirty, it's not clean at all. We're not allowed to wash our hands, and after we go to the restroom, we come back and continue wrapping the chopsticks.
The American market has been particularly interested in cheaper goods. And that whole Walmart psychology of going for cheaper stuff has really provided a market for Chinese-made goods.
I remember that I was forced to knit the sweaters, and all handmade. We were forced to knit. And we were told that they were all exported to European countries or America. So maybe some of the sweaters you wear is made by Falun Gong practitioners in the labor camp.
There have been governments and businesses and also the silence of the media who have all, in a sense, sold out their morality, essentially for certain kinds of gains, usually monetary gains. Some of it is political because China is involved in certain major decisions in regards to military operations around the world and that kind of thing, so they can exercise pressure.
More and more, what's called corporate responsibility is really just an excuse to build whatever the Chinese Communist Party wants to build at the time. And mostly, that is military technology or surveillance technology. In fact, that's the way these companies got ahead. That's why they're some of the only companies that are actually making a profit in China today, is because of what they've done. The fact is, people are being arrested every day in China. And after the Tiananmen Square massacre, Congress passed laws that were fairly explicit, saying you could not sell any surveillance equipment to the Chinese police. The message of that law is very clear. I think it's extremely important for American companies to back away from this kind of thing. Think of the strategy that the Chinese government is using here. They want the Chinese people to censor themselves. The surveillance is out there, but it's more than that. The government makes it obvious that the surveillance is out there. They've started to use these little cartoon figures which appear on your screen down south, which show a little policeman, a friendly little policeman, and a friendly little policewoman. And they're on your screen all the time to let you know you're being watched. You know, maybe you should watch what you're doing. Maybe you should watch what you're saying.
News organizations have either current or hoped for business interests in China, and it's well known that the regime will tell people in the context of business that if you do things that we're not pleased with, we can prevent you from doing business here.
Papers like the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times, if I'm not mistaken, have not been covering this issue. And perhaps it relates to the fact that your government is, dare I say, almost owned by the government of China in terms of the number of treasury bills and so on, more than 2 trillion.
You've always wanted to avoid the problems that occurred during the last century with the rise of Japan and Germany. And so what we have tried to do is to engage the Chinese, to integrate them into the international system. And because of that, we've become very indulgent. And essentially, when the Chinese have done bad things, we've treated them well. And so they continue being bad, we continue to treat them well. They are much more dependent on us than we are on them. Last year, about 140% of China's overall trade surplus related to sales to the United States. That's an incredible number. They've been running deficits with the rest of the world to run a surplus against us. So, of course, we see the Chinese as 10 feet tall, that they own us. They don't. They have to buy U.S. Treasury obligations because their economy is so dependent on the U.S. market. They have no choice.
Basically, they're trying to corrupt foreign democratic values and impose their own Chinese repressive values. And in some places, they get away with it. They use these Confucius institutes as a form of pressure. They shut down the Shenyang performing arts wherever they go. There was actually a lawsuit in Israel where Tel Aviv University shut down an art exhibit of Chinese art on the request of the Chinese embassy because there was a Confucius Institute there, and then there was a lawsuit about it.
Ever since, the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, where they killed many unarmed students, they've been trying to control the media because that exploded around the world, that incident. The local consulates and embassies have a very strong presence, and they have a lot of connections. They give a lot of rewards and trade-offs to people, and they're involved with Chinese language media outside of China as well. Those people who run those media outlets know what they're not supposed to talk about, and they know that if they talk about those certain things, Uncle so-and-so ever back in China could be persecuted in various ways if their news organization reports on things that the Chinese regime does not want them to report on. That's mafia tactics. It's reprehensible, disgusting behavior, but that's the normal way that they operate.
As always in ethical questions, we heard few and different ideas and voices. People who were transplanted in China came and said our life was saved due to the fact that in China people can harvest organs without all the ethical limitations that they have in Israel or in other countries in the West.
You can fly to a place like Shanghai, check into the #1 People's Hospital, and they take your blood type and your tissue type. They find there's a match for you in, say, camp number 75, and you're told you're getting the liver from a convicted criminal who was going to be executed anyway, so you're desperate about your liver, and you want to believe the person was going to die anyway, and you fly back to San Diego with your new liver, and somebody has died so that you could have the new liver.
When I've asked my patients who was about to go to China, does he know what the source of organs, the heart that he's going to get there, does he know what the source is? And he said that he didn't bother to ask. All that he knows that he wanted to save his life. Similarly, several other patients who at that time went to China, who were asked by me and by other physicians here, what's their reaction? I mean, to the fact that they're going to be saved by executed prisoners or other people whose hearts they're going to get. They told they couldn't face this reality, and they simply decided to push all these thoughts aside.
I cannot condemn the patients who are facing the choice to die or have their transplant. They would not have gone to China if there was no solution for their problem in China.
Unfortunately, in medicine, as in many other things, unethical transplant practice is often bad medicine. They often go together. In fact, in the hospital now, I just came from the hospital now, we have a patient who's very sick, very ill, coming back from a country where she'd received a traffic transplant. And of course, it became very complicated. So there are consequences.
Because there are actually in the United States, I mean, prisoners who want to donate, and they're not allowed to amongst the prisoners sentenced to death. So they're not allowed to because it's, you know, it's considered unethical to take organs from prisoners sentenced to death.
There are other problems associated with Chinese transplantation. It's not just the use of executed prisoners, how those kidneys, how those organs, livers, kidneys, hearts are then allocated to people. Are they given to the Chinese in need or to rich people coming from abroad who buy organs, and the poor Chinese can't afford them because they're not allocated in a manner that is transparent and accountable. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying this, the Chinese government itself has said it, there is a corrupt money chain that's associated with the organs that are taken from these executed prisoners. Corruptive money chain that is hard to stop once you've started it.
There's a tendency to think of any new medical development as a benefit to humanity. That's certainly the intent of its developers, but medical research, no matter how far advanced, comes face to face with the same old capacity for good and evil.
Jana Bin Li foi uma universitária comum até 1999, mas desde então tem vivido pesadelo por ser seguidora do Falun Gong na China.
People could not imagine how evil inside. It's a kind of place like hell on earth. And the first we have to they search our body and take out all our clothes. And then I was taken to an isolated room. And I remember 2 police women there waiting for me. They ordered me to write a guarantee not practicing Falun Gong anymore, and I refused. And they asked why. And I said, because I know it's the truth of the universe. The principle of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. There's nothing wrong with it. But they said, okay, then you squat down, and each holding my arm, and each holding one electric baton this length, and they start shocking me. And they said, you still refuse to write? I said, no, I will not write. And they started shocking me together. And they shocked me by using the electric batons, and started from my back, my neck, my arm. And several times I was beaten down, you know. And they pulled me up again and shocked me again. And on the same night, I couldn't lie down. I had to crawl, this way on the bed because I was scorched all over. I could smell the scorched hair and scorched skin. I was scorched all over. It was like barbecue, like kind of barbecue. When we were inside, we were not allowed to see their faces. I couldn't remember, I don't know who persecuted me, who tortured me, who scorched my back. Some practitioners were tortured to death. But in the midnight, far into the night, some practitioners were released. At that time, I thought that they were released, but no. Until one day I heard about organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners. I knew that they were not released at all. Maybe some of them were killed and were murdered, and the organs were removed. The Chinese Communist Party is just like a ghost, and sometimes they look evil, sometimes they can change their faces like an angel and they smile at you, but actually their goal is the same. They just want to brainwash you. We were not allowed to sleep. We were deprived of sleep. And they deprived our dignity. And they insulted us again and again. And until one day you cannot bear and feel that you are nothing. They talked to me and said, you said you are believing in truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. But do you think you are compassionate to us? We had to monitor you and we had to accompany you all day and all night. Do you think you are compassionate to us? And I think at that time, I already went insane. I was not rational anymore. I even thought that I'm so bad. Because of my existence, the police women had to persecute me and torture me by using electric batons. I'm so tired. I feel what I'm doing here, what's the use of my existence? I doubted myself. The concentrated persecution happening on me lasted about 14 months before I gave up. The Chinese Communist Party, they give you only two choices. One, die physically, they torture you physically, and the other one is die spiritually. I kept talking to myself, reminding myself that the Buddha can sacrifice his life for the truth of the universe. And I know my belief, I know it's the truth. I have to be determined to my belief, and for not only myself, but also for this world.
There's a mixture of religious and social and ethnic background that makes a lot of people reluctant to donate organs after their death.
Consent rate for organ donation in Israel has been low compared to all other Western countries, being in the 40–45% compared to 70 or 80%.
We know that there are Israelis that are sent from here, financed by their medical insurance organizations, to have organ transplantation in China. I asked for this special discussion in the Knesset today to make sure that we do not participate, we do not finance people to go to China to have such an organ transplantation.
Once we've published all the results of the Chinese organ procurement from executed prisoners in Israel, and Israel's main newspaper has published it in one of the big, huge exposé, our parliament, the Knesset, has convened, and at that time the new organ transplantation law has been discussed with the specific committee in the parliament. And we, together with my friends, made sure that one of the clauses, one of the major clauses in the organ transplant law would be banning of any reimbursement of transplant of Israelis performed abroad in case these transplants are performed in countries where organ harvesting is done against international laws and against the Israeli law. So from the moment the Israeli new law has been accepted by the parliament, this was in March 2008, no Israeli has gone to China to accept an organ over there. It's amazing. I'm preparing the talk for Buenos Aires, and I just got the final numbers from the Israel National Transplant Center, showing that since the new law, you can see it here, number for this entire year of live kidney transplant was 58, 2009 69, 2010 78, and this year 106. And this, you know, it's almost doubling the number, okay? And in parallel, the number of patients who went abroad for kidney has went down by 90%. As long as these transplants were reimbursed, fully reimbursed by the companies, Israeli would go there. The moment there's no reimbursement for this, that's it, no more Israelis. And I wish other countries would do that.
At this point, all roads lead back to China. I think people have, as collective groups, such as businesses, media, and government, vital and urgent decisions they need to make, because when something this horrific and this drastic has been going on for over 10 years and people are just turning away, mostly in exchange for a buck, I believe it's urgent and vital, and that people really have to stop and think when they're making the decision to turn their backs on one of the worst persecutions that have occurred in history.
As an individual, I can focus on human rights, I can focus on killing a Falun Gong for their organs, but governments have economic constituency, a political constituency, they've got military considerations, they have to balance off one against the other.
If diplomatic efforts fail, it is up to the medical community to do what it can in order to stop the Chinese colleagues from doing that. We, together with several American friends, have published several calls in international medical journals calling for a boycott or banning of any publication coming from Chinese physicians which are based on organ transplantation, the source of organs being executed prisoners. And hopefully, by concerted efforts of all medical associations around the globe, we'll be able at least to stop academically all Chinese physicians and to cut this chain of atrocities which is taking place in China.
I saw it as an example by which we would address the problem of transplant organ trafficking and tourism, that we recognize a problem and as a community try to address it, and hopefully the conclusions and our determination will become part of the bone marrow of anyone dealing with organ transplant donors, to know that the rights of the donors have to be protected, and that the recipients have to be protected, and that organs have to be recovered in an ethical fashion and allocated to people in an ethical fashion. The use of executed prisoners is a cheap trick. It's easy to get them, and as long as it's easy to get organs from executed prisoners, the pressure to develop alternatives will be less. The fact that it's abhorrent, it needs to stop, and it's a crime against humanity has been stated over and over. The WHO has said it. The question is, can they develop an alternative? But it's going to be a long time, I think, before they develop that in a manner that can address their needs. The Chinese government says that they're trying. I just have a sense that when the Chinese government really wants to do something, they do it.
They interfere with many things outside of their country when they're trying to silence people who are raising awareness about their many human rights abuses. What did I do about it? Well, I told people about it. I think that's the best way to address these kinds of things, is to make it known to people.
My own view is when you're talking about human rights activism, it's not one magic button that you press and all the problem just goes away. I think it's anything and everything, and different people can do different things. I mean, even if you just tell your nearest relative, I mean, that's something. You can write a letter, you can send an email, you can raise it with your member of parliament. A lot of people are members of non-governmental organizations, and they get them involved. And you get enough different people coming from enough different directions, then the whole thing collapses. I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and it looked as powerful now as the government of China is, and it just collapsed almost overnight. Or I was involved in pushing back the Iron Curtain. Again, it collapsed almost overnight. And I was also involved with the national security state problems in Latin America, and again, they've all gone. This kind of repressive power that you see in China, the Communist Party, it's very brittle. It's hard and brittle, and you know, constant little pieces of pressure eventually just make it collapse all at once. Mobilize enough people who know the truth, and all this sham of power disappears.
The more pressure we put on China, the more not just doctors, but governments and people make it clear to the Chinese authorities that this is unacceptable. I think the more effective we will all be. I genuinely would want to see Chinese enter the world of organ transplantation, become part of the international arena. They have a lot to offer. And I do believe, actually, that those progressive forces in China actually welcome press and professional and governmental attention that's been given to this, because I think it strengthens their hand.
People in China and all other countries, they interact, right? And people in other countries can also influence Chinese people. If more people know the truth, to make efforts to rescue Falun Gong practitioners, it's equivalent to saving people there. If more people awaken, and they will quit the Chinese Communist Party. Although I experienced a lot and so much pain and so much torture, I do not regret. I think using my own experience to let more people know about the truth and to awaken Chinese people who was not aware about the truth, I think it's worth it. We call everyone's attention to the persecution that's happening in China of Falun Gong practitioners because it's the most important thing today in the world. Why? Because you know what is Chinese Communist Party doing? The Chinese Communist Party is undermining the base for the existence of human beings. What's Falun Gong? Falun Gong is about the principle of truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. Without this principle, the world has no future.
What you see is that human rights violations are not self-contained. If you don't stop them, they spread. There's a tendency, at least initially, for people to say, that's not me, I don't have to be concerned. But human rights violations aren't just an attack on a defined group. They eventually just get a lot bigger. With the Holocaust, 6 million innocent Jews killed, but there was 37 million civilians killed, 31 of whom were not Jews. And it's a direct result of the anti-Semitism, which wasn't stopped before World War II. It stopped the anti-Semitism. I mean, the 6 million Jews would be alive, but 31 million others would also be alive. Oppressors have a very easy time oppressing their home constituency because they control the home territory, but they can't repress the whole world. So outsiders have the luxury of saying something that the people inside don't have the ability to say. And secondly, the repressive government feels it doesn't even really need the support of people inside because they can just throw them away if they don't agree. But they can't do that with outsiders. In a perverse sort of way, these repressive governments care more about what outside opinion is. Archimedes said, give me a big enough lever and I can move the world. And in Winnipeg, I'm far enough away that I've got as much leverage as one could possibly get. Part of the reason I got involved in this issue is that I'm not Chinese, that I'm not Falun Gong, that China's a long ways away, that this is a strange and different place. And I think if you're going to assert human rights, you have to jump across that kind of ideological, linguistic, racial, religious, spiritual divide to assert the unity of humanity. What we need to do is take that leap to help people who are victims who are not us. People have to see that they themselves are involved in this, that this threatens them, which it does.
Encontrei esta citação da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Primeiro, perseguiram os socialistas e eu não os defendi porque não era socialista. Depois, perseguiram os sindicalistas e eu não os defendi porque não era sindicalista. Em seguida, perseguiram os judeus e eu não os defendi, porque não era judeu. Então, perseguiram-me a mim e já não restava ninguém para me defender. Locução: Débora Henriques, Spell.